I spent my entire life building a legacy, believing with absolute certainty that my only son would be there to stand by my side when it mattered most. I am Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I have given 40 years of my blood, sweat, and tears as the chief engineer at Apex Dynamics. I thought my family was my greatest achievement. But when my son abandoned me on the most important night of my career, I made a split-second decision to invite someone else to take his empty seat. What happened next resulted in a $900,000 live television surprise, 115 missed calls in 4 hours, and the terrifying realization that my own flesh and blood was plotting to erase my freedom and lock me in a psychiatric ward. If you are watching this, take a deep breath, because the people you trust with your life might just be waiting for the perfect moment to steal it. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of my life's work. I was standing in front of the tall mirror in my bedroom, slowly adjusting the black bow tie around my collar. My fingers were trembling just a little bit. 40 years. 4 decades of missed dinners, late nights at the lab, and endless sacrifices, all leading up to this one corporate gala where the board of directors was honoring my service. I looked at the silver watch on my wrist. It was a gift I had bought for myself, a quiet reminder of how fast time slips away. My phone buzzed on the mahogany dresser. A sharp, brief vibration. I picked it up, expecting to hear my son's voice. Derek knew how much tonight meant to me. He knew I had reserved the VIP table right next to the stage specifically for him and his wife, Monica. But it was not a phone call. It was a text message. I stared at the bright screen, my heart slowly sinking into my stomach as I read the words. Dad, Monica, and I cannot make the gala. Massive work emergency. Proud of you. That was it. No phone call. No sincere apology. Just a cold, sterile text message. He had attached a vague, blurry photograph of an airport terminal window to prove he was traveling. I zoomed in on the picture, but there were no identifying signs, just the reflection of fluorescent lights on the glass. I stood there in the quiet of my bedroom, swallowing the bitter taste of disappointment. I had paid for Derek's elite college tuition. I had funded his first consulting firm. I had given him everything a father could possibly give. And on the night I needed him to simply sit in a chair and be proud of me, he was too busy to even dial my number. I looked at my reflection in the mirror again. I felt old. For the first time in my life, I felt truly old and discarded. But I am not a man who wallows in self-pity. I am an engineer. When a component fails, you find a replacement. I looked at the empty space on the bed where the 2 VIP tickets were resting. I was not going to let that chair sit empty. I was not going to let the board members look at me with pity. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I scrolled past the wealthy executives and the country club acquaintances. I stopped on a name I had not called in a few months. Leo Bennett. Leo was the son of my late best friend, Thomas. Thomas and I had started at the company together, but he passed away before he could see any real success. Leo was a hardworking young man struggling to keep his nonprofit science and engineering workshop afloat for underprivileged kids in the city. I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring, his voice sounding exhausted but warm. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I had an empty seat at my table tonight and asked if he would do me the honor of taking it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, with a voice choked with raw emotion, Leo told me he would be honored. He said his father always told him I was the greatest man he knew and that he would not miss it for the world. 45 minutes later, my town car pulled up to the front steps of the downtown convention center. The flashing lights of corporate news cameras illuminated the grand entrance. I stepped out of the car, and a moment later, a rusty 10-year-old sedan pulled up behind us. Leo stepped out. He was wearing an old, worn-out suit that was a little too tight in the shoulders. The cuffs were slightly frayed, and his tie was a faded navy blue. But the look in his eyes was priceless. I was practically overflowing with genuine, unadulterated pride for me. He walked up and shook my hand firmly, treating me with the kind of deep respect my own son had forgotten how to show. We walked into the grand ballroom together. The chandeliers glittered above us, and the room was filled with hundreds of the most influential people in the industry. We found our table right by the main stage. I pulled out the chair for Leo, the chair that was supposed to belong to Derek. As Leo sat down looking around the room in absolute awe, I felt a sudden pang of paternal worry. Despite my anger, Derek was still my son. A massive work emergency that required a sudden flight felt strange. I pulled my phone from my tuxedo pocket. Derek and I shared a family tracking app on our phones. We had installed it years ago when he was traveling overseas for college, and we just never turned it off. It was a habit to check when someone was flying. I opened the application, expecting to see a pin drop at the local international airport. I stared at the screen. The small icon representing Derek was completely grayed out. The text below his name read, "Location sharing paused." My blood ran cold. In the 10 years we had used that app, Derek had never manually turned off his location. Not once. You only turn off your location when you are going somewhere you do not want to be found. And you only send a blurry, unidentifiable picture of an airport when you are trying to hide where you really are. The bitter disappointment I felt earlier slowly morphed into a dark, sinking feeling in my gut. My 40 years as an engineer had trained my brain to look for anomalies, to spot the tiny fractures before the whole machine breaks apart. And my son was hiding a massive fracture. I slipped the phone back into my pocket as the CEO walked up to the microphone on the stage. The gala was beginning, but in my mind, a much darker countdown had just started. I kept my smile fixed in place as the cameras flashed, shaking hands with the board members and accepting their congratulations. Leo was still wiping tears from his face, completely overwhelmed by the reality of the grant that would save his workshop. He tried to speak to thank me again, but the applause drowned out his words. I squeezed his shoulder, giving him a reassuring nod, all while that continuous, violent vibration burned against my leg. It was a physical manifestation of panic, though I did not yet know whose panic it was. I forced myself to remain present, to smile for the photographs, and to exchange pleasantries with the executives. But my mind was entirely focused on the buzzing in my pocket. The gala eventually transitioned into a loud, crowded reception. I navigated through the sea of executives, making polite excuses about needing to rest after such a long evening. I escorted Leo to the main lobby where we parted ways. He walked out into the cool night air, clutching the symbolic check like a lifeline, his face glowing with hope. I watched him go, feeling a profound sense of peace with my decision. Then the heavy glass doors of the convention center closed behind me, cutting off the noise of the crowd. I stepped into the quiet sanctuary of my waiting town car. The heavy door shut with a solid thud, plunging the back seat into darkness, save for the passing streetlights. Only then did I reach into my pocket. I pulled out my phone, and the screen lit up the dim interior of the car. The numbers staring back at me were impossible to process at first glance. 115 missed calls, 42 new voicemails, all of them from Derek and Monica. The sheer volume of it was staggering, bordering on psychotic. This was not a simple work emergency. This was a complete and total meltdown. I leaned back against the cold leather seat and tapped the icon to play the first message. The time stamp showed it was left just minutes after the live broadcast announced the $900,000 grant. Derek's voice came through the small speaker, breathless and artificially cheerful. "Hey, Dad, wow, congratulations. We caught a stream of the broadcast during our layover. Such an honor. Give me a call as soon as you can. We need to talk about that grant money." I deleted it and moved to the next one. 10 minutes later. Derek again, the cheerfulness now strained, stretched thin over a layer of anxiety. "Dad, it is Derek again. Listen, we really need to get in touch. That announcement you made about the charity, that was just a PR move for the cameras, right? Call me back immediately. I listened to 5 more messages in rapid succession. The tone shifted with terrifying speed. The fake congratulations evaporated entirely, replaced by a frantic, mounting panic. Monica took over the calls around the 20th message. Her sweet, polished tone was gone, replaced by a sharp, trembling urgency that made my skin crawl. Richard, you need to answer your phone right now. You cannot give that money away to some kid. That was not the plan. You have to call the CEO and tell him you made a mistake. Call us back right now. The town car glided through the quiet city streets, the passing shadows playing across my face as I sat in absolute silence, listening to my family unravel over a corporate grant. By the time I reached the 35th voicemail, the panic had metastasized into unhinged rage. Derek was yelling into the receiver, his voice cracking with a desperation I had never heard from him before. He sounded like a cornered animal gasping for air. "Pick up the phone, old man. You are ruining everything. You have no idea what you just did." I sat frozen, the phone pressed hard against my ear, listening to the sun. I had given everything to scream at me as if I had stolen his very life. Then came the 40th message. It was Monica. Her voice was shrill, echoing in the confined space of the car, dripping with a venom I never knew she possessed. "You stupid, arrogant old fool. You gave our money to a beggar. That money belongs to us. Fix this right now, or I swear you will regret it." The recording clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the back of the car. I lowered the phone, staring at the darkened screen. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from a cold, creeping horror that was wrapping itself around my heart. "That money belongs to us." Her vicious words echoed in my mind over and over. The grant was awarded to me, a surprise gift from the company I had served faithfully for 4 decades. It was never promised to Derek. It was never his to claim. So why were they reacting like this? Why was a highly paid corporate consultant and his wealthy wife acting like desperate addicts who had just been robbed of their last dollar? People with stable, successful lives do not leave 115 missed calls in the span of a few hours. They do not scream unhinged threats at an elderly father over a charitable donation made on live television. The paternal instinct that had always driven me to protect my son was suddenly overshadowed by the sharp, analytical mind of a chief engineer. I was looking at the aftermath of a massive structural failure, and I needed to find the root cause before the entire building collapsed. The quiet, peaceful retirement I had envisioned just hours ago was completely gone, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The peace was over. The suspicion had taken root, cold and unyielding in the very center of my chest. Something was terribly wrong with my son's life, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. I barely slept that night. I sat in the darkness of my living room, the digital clock on the cable box glowing a faint red, marking the slow, agonizing passage of time. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Monica's shrill, unhinged voice echoing in the absolute silence of my home. "You gave our money to a beggar." Her cruel words were a physical weight on my chest, pressing down on my lungs until it was genuinely hard to breathe. I had spent 4 decades building a life of uncompromising integrity, teaching my only son the absolute value of hard work, honesty, and respect. Now I was staring into a terrifying, incomprehensible abyss. By 5 in the morning, I gave up on the futile idea of sleep entirely. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee and sat alone at the kitchen island, watching the first gray light of dawn creep slowly across the damp, manicured lawn. I was a chief engineer. I understood complex systems, structural weaknesses, and the importance of finding root causes. I was ready to systematically dismantle the lies and find the painful truth. I just did not expect those lies to arrive directly at my front door, before the sun was even fully present in the sky. At precisely 6 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on my front door began to pound with a frantic, desperate, and terrifying rhythm. It was not a polite, expected knock from a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was the unmistakable sound of sheer, unadulterated panic. I set my warm coffee mug down on the cold granite counter and walked slowly toward the foyer. Every muscle in my body suddenly tense and alert. Through the frosted glass panels framing the entrance, I could see two erratic, shifting silhouettes. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open. Derek and Monica practically fell into the hallway, bringing the freezing morning air inside with them. The sight of them made me physically recoil in shock. These were two people who always prided themselves on immaculate, flawless public appearances. Derek, a highly paid corporate consultant, usually looked like he had just stepped out of a luxury lifestyle magazine shoot. Monica was always perfectly styled, dripping in understated expensive wealth that demanded attention. But the couple standing in my quiet foyer looked completely destroyed. Their expensive clothes were horribly rumpled and stained with dark, unidentifiable patches. Derek's custom dress shirt was untucked and deeply wrinkled, his silk tie missing his hair, a disheveled, chaotic mess. Monica was trembling violently, her face pale and drawn, her eyes completely bloodshot and swollen from what looked like hours of hysterical, non-stop crying. Before I could even process the situation or ask what was going on, Monica dropped entirely to the hardwood floor. She collapsed right at my feet, grabbing my knees with a desperate, clawing grip. She began to sob with such raw, guttural intensity that the sound chilled my blood. She pressed her face hard against my legs, gasping for air between her agonizing cries. Derek stood behind her, leaning heavily against the painted wall, running his trembling hands over his face, looking completely shattered and utterly defeated by the world. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, the deep paternal instinct instantly overriding the cold, calculated suspicion I had harbored all night long. I reached down firmly, grabbing Monica by the trembling shoulders, trying to pull her up from the floor. I asked them what happened, demanding to know what was wrong and why they were in this horrifying state. Monica looked up at me, her face smeared with ruined expensive makeup, her chest heaving with every ragged breath. She claimed there was no massive work emergency at the consulting firm. She confessed that the text message featuring the blurry airport terminal was a desperate lie constructed to cover up a living, breathing nightmare. Between her breathless, erratic sobs, the horrifying story spilled out into the open. She said her younger brother, a foolish young man who was always looking for a dangerous shortcut in life, had traveled down to Mexico for a supposed lucrative business deal, but he had gotten mixed up with the absolute wrong people. She looked me dead in the eyes and swore he had been taken by a dangerous, ruthless, and heavily armed cartel. According to Monica, the cartel had violently kidnapped him right out of his hotel room in the middle of the night. They had contacted her 2 days ago with a terrifying, non-negotiable ransom demand. $800,000 in untraceable liquid funds, or they were going to send her brother back across the border in pieces. She claimed that she and Derek had been at the airport desperately trying to negotiate over untraceable burner phones, trying to figure out a way to fly down there or secure the massive funds without involving the federal authorities. She said the cartel had explicitly threatened to execute her brother immediately if the local police or the government were called for help. Derek stepped forward, his voice cracking, heavy tears streaming down his exhausted face. He said they were completely out of time. He said they had drained everything they could from their personal savings accounts, but they were still drastically short, and the final deadline was tonight. Then Monica tightened her painful grip on my knees, looking at me as if I were her only savior in a dark, unforgiving world. She screamed that the $900,000 grant was a literal miracle sent straight from God. She said it was the exact amount they needed to save her brother's life and bring him home safely. She begged me with a profound desperation that broke my heart into pieces. She told me I had to call the chief executive officer of Apex Dynamics immediately. She pleaded with me to swallow my professional pride, to tell the corporate board of directors that I had made a terrible, impulsive mistake on live television and to legally take the money back from Leo Bennett. "You have to save my brother," she wailed, her voice cracking and echoing off the high ceilings of my quiet foyer. You have to take that grant money and give it to us right now, or his blood is going to be on our hands forever. I am a man who has faced immense pressure throughout his career. I have successfully handled multi-million-dollar corporate crises and catastrophic engineering failures without blinking an eye. But hearing my daughter-in-law beg for a human life, seeing my only son weeping against my wall, the sheer emotional horror of the situation paralyzed my analytical mind. My thoughts raced wildly. The bizarre, erratic behavior, the secret flight location, the unhinged rage on the voicemails. It all suddenly seemed to perfectly align with the terrifying narrative of a desperate, panicked family trying to save a loved one from brutal murderers. I was absolutely horrified by the reality of their situation. The cold suspicion that had kept me awake all night completely evaporated in the face of this immediate life or death emergency. Blood and family always come first, no matter the cost or the sacrifice required. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline pump through my veins. I instinctively reached into my pocket, pulling out my smartphone with shaking hands. I knew exactly what I had to do. I was going to call my lawyer, wake him up, and tell him to contact the Apex Dynamics Finance Department to immediately halt the transfer of the grant to Leo Bennett. I was going to reroute the funds to save a life. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen of my smartphone. The contact for my attorney already pulled up and waiting for a single tap. My heart was hammering relentlessly against my ribs, driven by the pure, blinding adrenaline of a father, desperate to save a life. I was fully prepared to dismantle the $900,000 grant I had just awarded to Leo Bennett. I was ready to endure the professional humiliation, the corporate backlash, and the personal shame of taking back a charitable donation on live television. Because in that terrible moment, absolutely nothing mattered more than family. Monica was still on the floor, her hands gripping my knees with a desperate, clawing intensity that sent sharp spikes of pain through my legs. She was sobbing hysterically, burying her tear-stained face into the fabric of my trousers, playing the role of a devastated sister perfectly. Derek stood behind her, a broken man, covering his face with his trembling hands. The sheer terror in my foyer was suffocating. I looked down at my phone again, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves before making the call that would ruin his dreams. But as I prepared to press the call button, something caught my attention. It was a subtle thing, a tiny detail that most people would have easily missed in the middle of such intense emotional chaos. As Monica tightened her frantic grip on my knees, the loose sleeve of her rumpled designer blouse slid up her arm. My eyes, trained by 40 years of rigorous engineering inspections, naturally locked onto the exposed skin of her right wrist. There, stark against her artificially tanned skin, was a distinct, faded white line. It was perfectly straight, about an inch wide, and completely unnatural. It was the exact shape and size of a VIP resort wristband. I stared at that pale strip of skin, my analytical mind instantly snapping to attention. People who spend 72 hours trapped in a sterile fluorescent-lit airport terminal, frantically negotiating with a ruthless Mexican drug cartel, do not develop fresh, distinct tan lines on their wrists. That kind of marking comes from sitting under a blazing tropical sun for days on end, wearing an all-inclusive luxury resort band. The sudden realization was like a bucket of freezing water poured directly over my head. My thumb slowly moved away from the screen of my smartphone. The blinding panic that had gripped me just seconds ago began to rapidly evaporate, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I looked closer at Monica. She was still weeping, her shoulders heaving with dramatic sobs, but I was no longer seeing a terrified woman. I was observing a localized phenomenon, analyzing the data points presented right in front of me. As she shifted her weight on the hardwood floor, a subtle draft of air moved upward from her clothes. It hit my nose and my breath caught in my throat. It was not the stale, recycled air of an international airport waiting lounge. It was not the sweat of fear or the grim scent of exhaustion. It was a rich, unmistakable aroma of expensive coconut and papaya tanning oil mixed with a faint, lingering hint of sea salt and luxury hotel lotion. My mind began to race, processing the conflicting variables with the cold precision of a supercomputer. A cartel kidnapping negotiation is a high-stakes, high-stress environment. It involves burner phones, dark rooms, agonizing waiting periods, and unspeakable terror. It absolutely does not involve coconut papaya tanning oil and fresh resort tan lines. I looked up at Derek, who was still leaning heavily against the wall. His expensive dress shirt was wrinkled, yes, but the wrinkles looked intentional, like they had been hastily created in the back of a luxury town car rather than lived in for 3 days of hell. I noticed the faint redness on the bridge of his nose and the tops of his ears. It was a mild sunburn. The kind of sunburn you get from falling asleep on a private beach chair while sipping cocktails, not from pacing the cold floors of an airport terminal. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly shifting, forming a picture so monstrous I could barely comprehend it. They were lying. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind completely out of my lungs. They were standing in the sacred space of my home, looking me directly in the eyes, and fabricating a horrifying story about a life-or-death kidnapping. They were using the terrifying specter of a violent cartel execution to manipulate my deepest paternal instincts. And they were doing it all for one single sickening reason. They wanted to steal the $900,000 innovation grant. They wanted to rip the money away from Leo Bennett, a young man who was desperately trying to help underprivileged children, just to line their own already overflowing pockets. The sheer audacity of their lie was breathtaking. I had spent 4 decades designing complex heavy machinery, predicting structural failures before they happened, and calculating load-bearing limits. I knew exactly what a catastrophic failure looked like, and I was looking at one right now in the form of my own flesh and blood. The paternal love that blinded me for so long was systematically shut down, replaced by the ruthless logic of a corporate survivor. If I confronted them now, if I pointed out the tan line and the coconut oil, they would instantly pivot. They would deploy another emotional manipulation, and I would lose the tactical advantage. In engineering, when you discover a critical flaw, you silently gather your diagnostic data and map out the weak points. I slowly lowered my phone. "Let me rest for a few hours," I whispered, pretending to be completely exhausted. "Let me call the bank later this afternoon." I watched their eyes flash with greedy relief. The secret war had silently begun. As soon as the words left my mouth, the suffocating tension in the foyer seemed to evaporate. Derek let out a long, ragged exhale, sliding down the wall until he was sitting on the hardwood floor, his head resting against his knees. Monica released her painful grip on my legs, slumping backward, with a dramatic sigh of profound relief. They were good actors, I had to give them that. If I had not noticed that stark white tan line on her wrist, or if I had not recognized the distinct, sweet aroma of coconut and papaya tanning oil clinging to her skin, I would have been completely fooled. I would have drained a charitable foundation to fund whatever twisted vacation or reckless spending spree they had just returned from. I stood there looking down at my only son and his wife, feeling a bizarre disconnect from my own body. For 40 years, I had loved this boy unconditionally. I had celebrated his first steps, paid for his elite education, and financed his corporate dreams. Now I was looking at a stranger. A predator wearing my son's face, using a fabricated cartel kidnapping to extort his own father. I needed to play my part flawlessly. I reached down and gently helped Monica to her feet, acting the role of the frail, overwhelmed elder. My hands trembled intentionally as I guided her toward the living room sofa. Derek followed closely behind us, his shoulders slumped in a performance of utter exhaustion. I offered them glasses of water, limping slightly, as I walked to the kitchen, making sure they perceived me as entirely broken by their horrific news. When I handed Derek his glass, I noticed the faint redness on the bridge of his nose again. The mild sunburn was undeniable under the bright, recessed lighting of the kitchen. A cartel negotiation does not leave you with a sun-kissed glow. They had been on a luxury beach. They had been sipping expensive cocktails while I was accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award. And then they had concocted a story so vile, so emotionally manipulative, that it defied all logic and human decency. Monica took a sip of the water and looked at me with those wide, artificially tearful eyes. She reached out and patted my hand, a gesture that took every ounce of my willpower not to violently reject. She told me how incredibly grateful they were, how they knew they could always count on me to do the right thing and save her brother. I forced a weak, reassuring smile, telling her that family must always protect each other. The irony of my words was completely lost on them. They were so blinded by their own greed, so confident in their absolute superiority, that they could not see the trap I was silently building around them. They truly believed I was a gullible, easily manipulated old man who could be bullied into handing over nearly $1 million with a few fake tears and a dramatic kidnapping story. They had underestimated me entirely. Derek checked his gold wristwatch, a piece I had purchased for his 30th birthday, and let out another perfectly timed sigh. He told me that they needed to get back to their secure location to wait for the cartel's next phone call. He said time was critical, and he pressed me again about when I would contact the bank. I maintained my facade of exhaustion, rubbing my temples as if fighting a severe migraine. I told him that the bank branches did not open for specialized corporate transfers until 10 in the morning, and that it would take me a few hours to contact the Apex Dynamics Finance Department to officially reroute the innovation grant funds. I promised them I would handle the paperwork by early afternoon and wire the money directly to their account so they could pay the ransom. The relief that washed over Derek's face was sickening. It was not the relief of a man who had just secured his brother-in-law's safety. It was the greedy, unfiltered relief of a thief who had just successfully cracked a massive safe. He stood up, smoothing the intentional wrinkles in his expensive shirt, and pulled me into a tight embrace. He told me he loved me, that I was the greatest father in the world, and that he would never forget this sacrifice. I stood rigidly in his arms, feeling nothing but a vast, freezing emptiness. The boy I had raised was completely dead to me. In his place stood a corporate parasite, a monster who viewed my life's work as nothing more than a personal piggy bank waiting to be smashed open. Monica hugged me next, her coconut and papaya scent practically suffocating me. She whispered her fake gratitude into my ear, her voice dripping with toxic sweetness. I simply nodded, playing the exhausted patriarch until the very last second. I walked them to the front door, watching as they stepped out into the freezing morning air. Derek turned around one last time, reminding me to call him the absolute second the bank confirmed the massive transfer. I promised him I would. I stood in the doorway and watched them walk down the paved driveway to their luxury Porsche Cayenne. The moment the heavy car doors slammed shut and the engine roared to life, my weak, trembling posture instantly vanished. I stood up perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back, feeling the cold, ruthless energy of a chief engineer, taking complete command of a catastrophic failure. I watched the taillights disappear around the corner of my quiet suburban street. The silence of the morning returned, but my mind was operating at maximum capacity. The fabricated kidnapping was a desperate, sloppy lie. But why were they this desperate? They lived in an exclusive neighborhood. They drove luxury cars. They did not need to extort me for cash unless there was a massive hidden deficit waiting to destroy them. The red taillights of Derek's vehicle vanished around the corner, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence in the brisk morning air. I stood in the doorway, staring at the empty street. The cold wind bit at my face, but I barely felt it. The frail, exhausted posture I had carefully maintained instantly dissolved. I locked the heavy deadbolt, sliding the metal latch firmly into place. The click echoed in the quiet foyer, a definitive sound marking the end of my blind paternal trust. I was alone now, and the time for acting was over. I did not walk toward the telephone to call the Apex Dynamics chief executive officer. I did not call my bank to halt the $900,000 innovation grant. I walked past the kitchen, down the carpeted hallway, and into my private home office. I shut the solid oak door behind me and turned on the desk lamp. My mind was no longer clouded by the emotional manipulation of a frantic daughter-in-law or the manufactured tears of a desperate son. My mind was a steel trap operating with the precision of an engineer diagnosing a catastrophic mechanical failure. The fabricated cartel kidnapping was a sloppy narrative, a smokescreen designed to blind me with fear. But people do not construct lies of that magnitude unless they are trying to cover up a massive disaster. Derek and Monica lived in an exclusive neighborhood. They drove expensive cars and wore designer clothes. They had lucrative careers. They did not need to extort a charitable grant from their own family unless a devastating financial deficit was threatening to destroy their perfect public facade. I sat in my desk chair and booted up my private computer. I bypassed my regular smartphone entirely knowing that Derek had installed our shared family tracking applications and could potentially have access to my digital footprint. I needed absolute security. 5 years ago, when Derek was celebrating a major promotion at his consulting firm, I made a decision to secure his future. I established a joint trust account, intending for it to serve as his eventual inheritance. I funded it with the reliable returns from my early investments and the bulk of my lifelong savings. The account held exactly $2.5 million. It was a financial fortress designed to ensure my son would never experience the struggles I endured in my youth. I made him a joint account holder so he could manage the funds in the event of my unexpected death or sudden medical incapacitation. I trusted him with the keys to the vault because a father is supposed to trust his only son. I opened the encrypted banking portal on my monitor. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in my alphanumeric password with practiced ease. A security prompt appeared on the screen asking for a secondary authentication code. I retrieved the physical security token from my locked desk drawer and pressed the button, watching the digital numbers flash across the liquid crystal display. I typed the 6-digit code into the computer and pressed the Enter key. The loading circle spun for 3 agonizing seconds. The portal opened, displaying the dashboard of my financial life. My checking accounts, my modest daily savings, my corporate retirement fund, they were all exactly as they should be. I clicked on the specific tab for the joint trust account. I stared at the monitor. The numbers staring back at me did not make sense. I blinked, leaning closer to the screen, assuming the banking server was experiencing a temporary technical glitch. But the numbers did not change. The total available balance was $0.00. I sat completely frozen in my chair, the air suddenly turning thin and scarce in my lungs. $2.5 million. Gone. Evaporated into absolute nothingness. I grabbed my computer mouse, my hand trembling with a sudden violent surge of adrenaline, and clicked on the detailed transaction history. The ledger populated, instantly revealing a horrifying systematic destruction of my life's work. The money had not vanished years ago or months ago. It had been completely drained over the last 72 hours. While I was putting on my tuxedo, while I was sitting at the Apex Dynamics corporate gala, while I was proudly watching Leo Bennett accept a life-changing grant, my own son was systematically stripping away my financial legacy. There were 4 massive consecutive wire transfers: $600,000, $800,000, another $600,000, and a final sweep of $500,000. All executed in a frantic compressed window over the weekend. I stared at the empty ledger, feeling a profound, terrifying shift suddenly occurring deep within my very soul. The final lingering shreds of my parental denial burned away, leaving only a cold, hardened ash. This horrific situation was never about a Mexican cartel, and it was never about saving a kidnapped brother-in-law. The $900,000 innovation grant was simply a convenient target of opportunity. My son had robbed me completely blind, gutting the very foundation of his own inheritance. He had dug a $2.5 million grave for himself, and he was now desperate for another $900,000 in liquid cash to cover his tracks and survive whatever monster he had awakened. He had looked me directly in the eyes and weaponized my love to steal the last remaining pieces of my dignity. I slowly reached over and closed the laptop. The screen went black, reflecting my own stern, uncompromising face in the dark glass. The gentle, forgiving father who had opened the front door this morning was dead. My son had declared war on my life, and he had done it silently behind my back. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot that he learned everything he knew from me. The war had silently begun, and I was going to finish it. I stared at the dark computer monitor for a long time. The reflection of my face showed a man who had just lost his only son, not to an illness or a tragic accident, but to a profound and sickening greed. I took a deep shuddering, pushing the suffocating grief down into a small locked compartment in my mind. There would be plenty of time to mourn the death of my family later. Right now, I needed to systematically dismantle a hostile corporate takeover. I picked up the telephone on my desk. I bypassed my personal contacts entirely now. I dialed a specific number I had memorized decades ago. I called Harrison Cole. Harrison was not a standard family lawyer. He was a ruthless, razor-sharp corporate attorney who specialized in high-stakes litigation, asset recovery, and the absolute destruction of corporate enemies. We had fought side by side in the brutal trenches of the industry for over 30 years. He answered the line on the first ring. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or emotional apologies. I simply told him everything. I explained the fabricated cartel kidnapping story and the terrifying voicemails I had just received. I detailed the hidden power plays and the absolute zero balance in the joint trust account. Harrison remained completely silent while I spoke, absorbing the critical data with cold, calculated precision. When I finally finished speaking, he uttered a single decisive sentence. He told me to stay exactly where I was, while he immediately deployed his rapid response team. Within 10 minutes, Harrison had fully mobilized a massive group of elite forensic accountants, legal investigators, and top-tier cybersecurity experts. But I knew Derek very well. I knew he was highly intelligent and dangerously paranoid about his grand schemes. He had installed those family tracking applications on my personal devices years ago, supposedly for my safety, but now clearly as a surveillance tool to monitor my movements. If he saw my digital footprint moving toward a high-powered law firm downtown, he would instantly realize his cartel kidnapping lie had completely failed. He would panic, and he would accelerate whatever monstrous plan he had secretly set in motion. I needed to construct a flawless smokescreen to buy myself the vital tactical advantage of time. I walked back into my master bedroom and picked up my expensive, easily tracked smartphone. I plugged it securely into the wall charger on my nightstand, ensuring the battery would never die and drop off the digital tracking grid. I turned the volume all the way up and set the ringtone to a generic sound, just in case Derek tried to call and listen for my location. I carefully arranged my pillows under the heavy duvet, creating the highly convincing shape of a sleeping body. If he somehow managed to hack into the home security cameras I had installed in the hallways, he would simply see the quiet, undisturbed sanctuary of an exhausted old man. I grabbed a thick stack of cash reserves from my hidden wall safe, put on a nondescript dark jacket, and silently slipped out through the back door. The freezing morning air hit my face as I walked 3 blocks away from my quiet suburban street. I found a small local convenience store and purchased a cheap, untraceable burner phone with a prepaid data plan. I activated it right there on the concrete sidewalk, dialing Harrison to give him my temporary, highly secure contact number. Then, I hailed a standard city taxi, avoiding my recognizable town car entirely for absolute safety. The long ride to the downtown financial district was a blur of gray concrete buildings and flashing traffic lights. My analytical mind raced through endless tactical calculations trying to accurately predict Derek's next move. I finally arrived at the towering glass and steel skyscraper where Harrison maintained his absolute fortress of an office. The armed security guards at the front desk had already been instructed to expect me. They escorted me to a private, secure elevator that opened directly onto the top executive floor. Harrison was waiting patiently for me inside his massive, perfectly clean, very high-tech conference room. He did not offer me a comforting hug or any useless words of emotional sympathy. He simply offered me a hot cup of black coffee and a comfortable seat at the head of a long, highly polished mahogany table. The room was already buzzing with intense, focused activity. 3 forensic accountants were furiously typing on encrypted laptops, totally surrounded by massive stacks of financial documents and thick legal briefs. Harrison stood closely beside me, his strong arms crossed over his tailored suit. His sharp eyes fixed intensely on the large digital projection screen mounted directly on the back office wall. He softly explained that his team had already bypassed the standard banking delays by utilizing specialized legal subpoenas and backdoor financial channels. They were currently dissecting the exact mathematical trajectory of the stolen $2.5 million. I sat in absolute silence, carefully watching the bright numbers flash across the glowing screen. I was a chief engineer. I perfectly understood how to build complex things, how to make massive pieces of heavy machinery work in perfect harmony. I did not understand the dark, convoluted world of financial fraud. But Harrison did. He moved like a hungry corporate shark. He directed his entire team with sharp, rapid commands. An hour passed in tense, suffocating silence. Then the lead accountant, a young woman with a piercing gaze, suddenly stopped typing. She looked up at Harrison, her expression extremely grim. She had found a disturbing anomaly. Harrison stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he read the data on her screen. He turned to me, his voice dangerously low. The $2.5 million had not been withdrawn as physical cash. It was successfully wired to an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. He was completely robbing me blind. The horrifying reality of the Cayman Islands account hung heavily in the air of the polished conference room. Harrison stood perfectly still, his sharp eyes locked on the digital projection screen, waiting for my inevitable reaction. I did not scream, and I did not shatter the expensive coffee mug resting in my trembling hands. Instead, the profound betrayal acted like a freezing agent in my veins, numbing the lingering pain of a broken father and leaving behind only the ruthless calculation of an Apex Dynamics chief engineer. My son had not just stolen my life savings. He had executed a highly sophisticated financial maneuver that required extensive planning, deep offshore connections, and a level of criminal intent I never thought him capable of possessing. If he was already hiding millions of dollars in untraceable international accounts, the fabricated cartel kidnapping story was merely a smokescreen for a much larger, far more devastating operation. I needed to know exactly what his next move was, and I needed to know it right now before he could inflict any more damage on my legacy. I leaned forward over the mahogany table, my mind racing through every single asset, every connection, and every piece of leverage I still held over Derek. He had drained the joint trust fund, and he believed he was entirely untethered from my financial control. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. 3 years ago, when his consulting firm landed its first major client, he wanted to project an image of absolute corporate success. He asked me to help him secure a luxury vehicle. I agreed, signing the lease for a custom black Porsche Cayenne under my own name to guarantee him the lowest possible interest rate. The vehicle was his to drive, but legally, the title and ultimate ownership privileges belonged entirely to me. I looked up at Harrison, a cold, predatory smile slowly forming on my face. I asked his lead cybersecurity expert if it was legally permissible for a registered vehicle owner to access the manufacturer's emergency diagnostic systems. Harrison simply nodded, his eyes widening as he instantly grasped the tactical brilliance of my sudden realization. I pulled the secure burner phone from my jacket pocket and immediately dialed the elite concierge service for the luxury dealership. When the customer service representative answered the line, I provided my full legal name, my date of birth, and the primary account authorization code I had established when I signed the original lease. I adopted the frantic, worried tone of a father experiencing a terrifying family emergency. I told the representative that my son was driving the vehicle, that he had recently been experiencing severe medical episodes, and that he was currently not answering any of my desperate phone calls. I explicitly invoked my legal owner privileges, demanding that they immediately activate the emergency SOS cabin microphone so I could determine if he was conscious and safe inside the vehicle. The representative hesitated for only a fraction of a second before the override protocols were authorized. She provided me with a secure digital link and a temporary access passcode, strictly advising me to contact emergency medical services if I heard any signs of physical distress. Harrison quickly connected my burner phone directly to the high-fidelity audio system integrated into the conference room. He dimmed the overhead lights to reduce any visual distractions, plunging the large room into a cool, shadowed darkness. The three forensic accountants stopped typing on their encrypted laptops, and the entire legal team gathered silently around the long table. I typed the access passcode into the digital link and pressed the activation button. For 5 agonizing seconds, there was only a low, rhythmic burst of digital static filling the silent room. Then the audio connection stabilized, and the crisp, unmistakable sound of a powerful engine accelerating through city traffic echoed from the overhead speakers. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the wooden table so hard my knuckles turned completely white. Over the low hum of the luxury tires rolling across the pavement, a sudden burst of loud, joyous laughter pierced the heavy silence of the law office. It was Monica. Her laughter was bright, genuine, and entirely devoid of the hysterical terror she had weaponized in my foyer just hours earlier. Derek joined in, his voice relaxed and practically vibrating with arrogant triumph. I sat frozen in the dark room, listening live as the two people I had loved most in the world celebrated my absolute gullibility. Derek mocked my exhausted posture, laughing at how easily I had swallowed the ridiculous cartel kidnapping narrative. He told Monica that I was just a sentimental, fading old man who could not see past his own pathetic need to be the family savior. Monica cheerfully agreed loudly, wondering if I was currently sitting at home crying over her fictional brother while eagerly transferring the $900,000 innovation grant into their greedy hands. Every cruel word they spoke felt like a physical strike, but I did not look away, and I did not let the intense emotional pain break my absolute focus. I needed the final piece of the puzzle. Then the celebratory laughter slowly faded, and the conversation shifted to business. Derek told Monica to check the GPS navigation system to ensure they were not running late. He confidently stated that they could not afford to keep the Nexus executives waiting at the downtown hotel suite. When those specific words echoed through the conference room speakers, the blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. Nexus Global was certainly not just another standard corporate competitor. They had spent the entirety of the last decade aggressively attempting to steal our proprietary engineering designs and completely dismantle our market dominance. Why was my son meeting with the highest-level executives of my greatest corporate enemy right after stealing my life savings? The answer hit me with devastating clarity, completely shifting the parameters of this new war. The static from the Porsche cabin microphone continued to hum through the overhead speakers of the dark conference room. I sat perfectly still, my hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table, my mind desperately trying to process the monstrous reality of my son meeting with Nexus Global executives. Harrison Cole stood beside me, his sharp silhouette barely visible in the dim lighting. We did not exchange a single word. We just kept listening, completely captivated by the horrifying audio feed, broadcasting live from the luxury vehicle. The celebratory atmosphere inside the car began to shift. The triumphant laughter faded, replaced by a cold, calculating tone that made my blood run entirely cold. Monica was the one who broke the silence. Her voice rang out through the speakers, clear, sharp, and dripping with an absolute venomous greed. I could hear the faint rustling of paper as she spoke. She told Derek to forget about the $900,000 innovation grant. She actually called my life-changing charitable donation mere pocket change. It was a staggering statement. They had just performed an award-winning theatrical breakdown in my foyer over that money begging for a man's life, and now she was dismissing it as completely insignificant. That money was just a distraction to keep me occupied, she said, her tone utterly ruthless. She then asked Derek the question that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. She asked him if the medical power of attorney was fully ready. The words hung in the freezing air of the law office. A medical power of attorney is not a standard financial document. It is a profound legal instrument designed to strip away a person's fundamental human rights and transfer absolute control of their bodily autonomy and life decisions to someone else. It is a document meant for the tragic end of life for individuals suffering from severe dementia or irreversible comas. I leaned closer to the audio speaker, my breath catching in my throat. Derek's voice came through the static, completely devoid of any hesitation or filial guilt. He confidently confirmed that the paperwork was finalized. He bragged to his wife that he had successfully secured a forged signature from a corrupt local judge who owed his consulting firm a massive favor. The legal trap was completely set and perfectly primed to snap shut on my life. But a medical power of attorney is absolutely useless unless the individual is actually incapacitated. I waited in agonizing silence to hear how they planned to overcome that massive legal hurdle. I was a perfectly healthy, highly functioning 70-year-old man who had just accepted a major corporate award on live television. No legitimate doctor in the world would ever declare me legally incompetent. Derek began to outline their sinister strategy, and every word he spoke was like a physical knife twisting deep into my chest. He told Monica that they were going to execute the final phase of their operation this coming Friday morning. They planned to visit my house under the guise of a loving family check-in. They knew my morning routine perfectly. They knew I always sat on the back patio reading the financial newspapers while enjoying a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee. Derek explained that he had procured a highly concentrated dose of heavy prescription sedatives from a black market contact. These were not mild sleeping pills. They were potent, fast-acting central nervous system depressants designed to induce a state of severe immediate cognitive collapse. Their plan was horrifyingly simple and utterly flawless. While I was distracted by Monica's fake affection, Derek was going to slip the heavy sedatives directly into my morning coffee. He calmly explained the medical mechanics of his treason to his wife as they drove through the city. Within 20 minutes of consuming the poisoned beverage, the severe chemical depressants would completely override my nervous system. I would begin to violently slur my words, lose all physical coordination, and inevitably collapse onto the floor in a state of profound, terrifying confusion. At that exact moment, playing the roles of the traumatized, caring family members, they would immediately dial emergency services. They would frantically tell the emergency dispatch operators that their elderly father was suffering from a massive, catastrophic stroke. When the paramedics finally arrived with the screaming ambulance sirens, Derek would present the forged medical power of attorney. He would use the chaotic, high-stress environment of a medical emergency to completely bypass any standard legal scrutiny. Once I was loaded into the back of the ambulance, heavily sedated and entirely unable to speak or defend myself, my fate would be entirely sealed. The sheer, calculated cruelty of the plot paralyzed me. I sat in the dark conference room, staring blindly at the glowing audio equipment on the table. Harrison Cole slowly placed his hand on my shoulder, a rare gesture of genuine sympathy. The accountants behind us completely stopped their work. The entire room was gripped by a suffocating, horrified silence. Through the speakers, Monica enthusiastically praised the brilliant simplicity of the poisoned coffee plot. She eagerly anticipated taking total control of my entire existence. I realized in that terrible moment that they were not just ordinary thieves looking to steal a few $1 million. A thief simply takes your money and runs away into the night. Derek and Monica were planning something infinitely worse. They were actively planning to systematically erase my fundamental freedom. They wanted to permanently lock me away in a secure, sterile psychiatric ward, heavily medicated and entirely forgotten by the outside world. They wanted to strip away my dignity, my agency, and my voice, reducing my 40 years of hard-earned legacy to the tragic story of a broken old man who simply lost his mind. The war had escalated beyond my finances. They were coming for my life, and I had only until Friday to build a fortress they could never breach. The chilling audio feed from the luxury vehicle finally cut out, leaving a suffocating silence in the dark conference room. I sat perfectly still, my mind reeling from the sheer scale of the betrayal. Harrison Cole looked at me from across the mahogany table, his sharp eyes reflecting the same profound horror I felt. A medical power of attorney was the ultimate weapon of total subjugation, but it still left one massive, glaring question completely unanswered. Why the sudden rush? Why were my son and his wife planning to execute this terrifying plot on a Friday morning? And what possible connection did a psychiatric hold have with the highest-level executives at Nexus? Global Nexus was a corporate predator, a rival engineering firm, that cared absolutely nothing about my personal finances or my family drama. They only cared about industry dominance. The pieces of the puzzle were violently clashing together in my mind, refusing to fit. I needed the missing link. I stood up from the leather chair, the exhaustion completely vanishing from my bones. I told Harrison to keep his team working on the offshore accounts while I found the final answer. I left the secure law office and stepped back out into the freezing city air. I hailed a passing taxi, instructing the driver to take me directly to the Apex Dynamics corporate headquarters on the edge of the financial district. I did not ask him to stop at the grand front entrance with the revolving glass doors and the security checkpoints. Instead, I directed him to the secure underground parking garage. My biometric executive pass granted me absolute, unrestricted access to every level of the facility. I swiped my hand across the scanner, slipping through the heavy steel doors and completely bypassing the crowded main lobby. I did not want any rumors of my sudden arrival to reach the corporate board just yet. I walked quickly down the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the basement levels, heading straight for the cybersecurity division. I bypassed the standard technician cubicles and walked directly into the glass office of David Miller, the chief of cybersecurity. He looked up from his dual monitors, thoroughly shocked to see the chief engineer standing in his office without a scheduled appointment. I did not offer him a polite greeting. I grabbed him by the arm and pulled him out of his office, marching him down the hallway and directly into a soundproof server vault. The massive room hummed with the constant cooling breeze of the mainframe towers. I looked him dead in the eyes and ordered him to lock the door. I told him this was a Tier 1 security emergency and that absolute discretion was mandatory. I instructed him to immediately bypass the standard corporate firewalls and pull the complete proxy server logs connected to my personal home network and my secure virtual private network access. David did not ask any questions. He saw the cold, uncompromising desperation in my face. He pulled a portable diagnostic terminal from a secure locker, plugged it directly into the primary server bank, and began typing furiously across the illuminated keyboard. The dark screen flashed with lines of green code as the system painstakingly pulled the requested data from the encrypted archives. I stood right behind him, watching the digital history of my network materialize before my eyes. We waited in agonizing silence as the massive data files slowly loaded onto the terminal. Then the transfer logs finally appeared. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to absolute ice. The records showed a massive, sustained extraction of highly classified data. Over the last 7 days, while I was occupied with the gala preparations and the charitable grant, someone had been systematically downloading my private files. They had not hacked the system from the outside. They had completely bypassed the intense security measures by utilizing my own backup emergency credentials, a set of access codes that Derek held solely for the purpose of a catastrophic medical event. He had used the trust of a son to quietly infiltrate the deepest, most secure vault of my personal legacy. David pointed to the specific file directories that had been breached. It was not financial data or internal company memos. Derek had spent an entire week secretly downloading the highly classified, unpatented blueprints for the Apex next-generation turbine technology. This was not just another project. This was the absolute pinnacle of my 40-year engineering career. It was a revolutionary design that would completely dominate the global energy market for the next 2 decades. I had spent countless nights perfecting the complex thermodynamics and the intricate mechanical structures, and my son had stolen every single page of it. The horrifying realization slammed into me with the force of a freight train. Derek had not just robbed my joint trust account, and he was not just trying to steal a $900,000 charitable grant. He had orchestrated a massive, highly illegal corporate espionage deal to sell my engineering legacy directly to Nexus Global for $15 million. But there was a massive legal barrier standing in his way. Intellectual property of that magnitude could not simply be handed over on a digital flash drive. To legally transfer the highly valuable patents to a rival corporation, Nexus Global required my absolute verifiable consent. They needed my direct biometric signature on the transfer deeds. If I was fully conscious and completely aware, I would obviously never sign those treasonous documents. But if Derek successfully drugged me on Friday morning and utilized the forged medical power of attorney to have a corrupt judge declare me completely incompetent, he would instantly gain absolute legal control over my intellectual property. He would be legally authorized to sign the patent transfer deeds on my personal behalf. The entire catastrophic failure was now perfectly illuminated directly in front of me. My son was planning to permanently erase my mind to steal my legacy. The glowing screen of the proxy server log illuminated the cold, soundproof vault. David Miller stood beside me in absolute silence. His eyes were fixed on the digital evidence of my son and his betrayal. The sheer scale of the theft was beyond anything I had ever imagined. It was a meticulous and highly calculated act of corporate espionage. Derek had not simply taken my money or plotted to steal a charitable grant. He had methodically extracted the very essence of my 40 years of engineering brilliance. The classified blueprints for the next-generation turbine technology represented our entire future. I was handing them over to Nexus Global for $15 million. As I stared at the downloading history, the last ounce of paternal mercy remaining in my heart completely shattered and dissolved into nothingness. There was no more room for forgiveness, no more space for parental denial, and absolutely no more hope for his redemption. My son was a ruthless corporate predator, and I was going to treat him exactly as one. I instructed David to immediately lock down the compromised servers and strictly isolate the network without alerting the external recipient. We needed to contain the digital hemorrhage. We left the access pathways visibly open, creating the perfect illusion that Derek was still operating undetected. I left the cybersecurity vault and took the secure elevator directly to the top floor of the corporate headquarters. I bypassed the executive assistants and walked straight into the private office of the chief executive officer of Apex Dynamics. He looked up from his mahogany desk, surprised by my sudden appearance, but the absolute gravity in my expression silenced any questions. I laid the printed proxy logs and the detailed offshore banking records directly onto the polished surface of his expensive desk. I explained the forged medical power of attorney, the heavy prescription sedatives, and the impending treasonous meeting with the Nexus Global executives. The CEO turned pale, instantly grasping the catastrophic implications of the stolen turbine patents falling into the hands of our fiercest competitor. He immediately picked up his secure telephone and initiated a high-priority emergency protocol. Within an hour, the corporate boardroom was transformed into a highly secure command center. 3 undercover federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation specifically assigned to the corporate espionage division, arrived through the underground parking garage to join our confidential meeting. They were seasoned professionals men who specialized in dismantling high-level corporate treason and white-collar crime syndicates. I sat at the head of the massive conference table flanked by the CEO and Harrison Cole, while the federal agents meticulously reviewed the evidence. They examined the digital footprints, the Cayman Islands wire transfers, and the terrifying audio recording captured from the luxury vehicle. The lead agent, a tall man with a sharp and uncompromising demeanor, stated that we had enough preliminary evidence to arrest Derek and Monica immediately for grand wire fraud. But arresting them now would be a mistake. Arresting them immediately would only sever the tail of the snake. Nexus Global would simply deny any direct involvement, claiming they had no prior knowledge of the stolen intellectual property. We needed to catch the Nexus executives directly in the act of receiving the stolen patents and exchanging the illegal corporate funds. I looked at the faces gathered around the table, feeling a cold and ruthless clarity settle deep within my mind. I presented my strategy, a comprehensive plan designed to use Derek's own arrogant confidence as the absolute instrument of his total destruction. We would not confront him directly. We would not lock the doors of my house or raise any alarms. We would let him believe he was executing a flawless and completely undetected operation. We would allow him to bring the forged medical power of attorney and the heavy prescription sedatives into my home on Friday morning. The federal agents agreed to the tactical approach, recognizing the unparalleled opportunity to completely dismantle a rival corporate espionage ring in a single decisive strike. They immediately began drafting the operational parameters, coordinating the necessary surveillance equipment, and staging the tactical intervention teams that would be required for the mission. I provided them with the detailed architectural floor plans of my house, highlighting the optimal positions for hidden cameras and concealed microphones. We choreographed every single movement, anticipating Derek and his actions with the rigorous precision of a complex engineering schematic. The plan was incredibly dangerous and carried an immense personal risk. I would have to sit in my living room, face the son who was actively trying to destroy my mind, and convincingly play the role of the frail, unsuspecting victim. I would have to let him poison my coffee and pretend to succumb to the heavy prescription sedatives. I would have to wait while the Nexus Global executives walked through my front door to steal my legacy. But I was no longer an ordinary father hoping for a miraculous reconciliation. I was the chief engineer of Apex Dynamics, and I was meticulously forging a countertrap made of solid steel. The meeting concluded with a definitive and unbreakable resolve. I left the corporate headquarters through the secure basement exit and returned to the quiet streets of my suburban neighborhood. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light across the manicured lawns and the peaceful driveways. It looked like a perfect, tranquil community, entirely disconnected from the monstrous treason unfolding beneath the surface. I walked through my front door and securely locked the heavy deadbolt. I walked into my bedroom, picked up my regular smartphone from the nightstand, and turned the device back on. I opened my messages and typed a carefully calculated text to Derek. "Come over Friday morning. I have the papers ready to transfer the grant money to you." I hit send. Less than 10 seconds later, he replied instantly. "Can't wait, Dad. I'll bring your favorite coffee." The trap was completely set. Thursday evening arrived with a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to fill every single corner of my house. I sat alone in the living room, watching the shadows stretch across the hardwood floor as the sun dipped below the horizon. The reality of what was going to happen the next morning weighed on my chest like a physical block of concrete. I was preparing to hand my only son over to federal agents. I was preparing to watch him be arrested for corporate espionage and elder abuse. The emotional toll was staggering, leaving me feeling entirely drained and broken inside. Just as the dark thoughts began to overwhelm my mind, a gentle knock echoed from the front door. I slowly pushed myself up from the armchair and walked toward the foyer, expecting to see a delivery driver or a neighbor. When I opened the heavy wooden door, I found Leo Bennett standing on the porch. He was wearing the same faded navy blue tie he had worn to the corporate gala, but his face was completely transformed. The exhaustion and the constant worry that usually clouded his expression were entirely gone, replaced by a radiant, undeniable sense of deep hope. He held a thick manila folder in his hands, pressing it tightly against his chest, as if it contained the most precious treasure in the world. I invited him inside, guiding him toward the kitchen island, where the bright overhead lights illuminated the space. He did not ask for a drink or sit down. He immediately opened the folder and spread a series of glossy photographs across the granite countertop. His hands were shaking with pure excitement as he pointed to the printed colored images. They were pictures of a massive empty warehouse with high ceilings and wide, clean windows. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion, "I just signed the commercial lease this afternoon. This is the new permanent home for the Youth Engineering Workshop. We used the first installment of the Innovation Grant to secure the building for the next 5 years. We are going to build real robotics laboratories, computer programming stations, and a dedicated fabrication shop for the kids." I looked down at the photographs, seeing the raw potential in the empty concrete space. I could clearly envision the rows of workbenches, the bright fluorescent lights, and the eager faces of curious children. Children who previously had absolutely no opportunities would now have a highly safe place to learn to grow and to build their own futures. Leo looked at me, his eyes welling up with heavy tears. He told me that he had spent the entire day visiting the local schools, telling the students about the brand new facility that was opening next month. He described the sheer disbelief and the overwhelming joy on their young faces when they realized someone was actually investing in their true potential. "You did this, Mr. Caldwell," he whispered, wiping a stray tear from his cheek. "You changed the trajectory of hundreds of lives with a single decision. You gave these kids a reason to believe in themselves, and you gave me the ability to fulfill the dream of my father. I could not have done any of this without your profound and extreme generosity." As I stood there listening to his gentle words, a profound shift occurred deep within my tired soul. I looked closely at Leo. I saw his unwavering dedication, his deep respect for his late father, and his absolute commitment to lifting up those around him. I saw the man I had desperately hoped Derek would become. For decades, I had blindly believed that blood was the ultimate unbreakable bond, that sharing a last name automatically guaranteed profound loyalty and unconditional love. But the universe was presently presenting me with a stark, undeniable contrast directly inside my kitchen. My biological son, a man who had enjoyed every conceivable luxury and endless privilege, was actively plotting to erase my mind with heavy sedatives to steal my entire legacy. Meanwhile, the struggling son of my late best friend, a young man who had grown up with virtually nothing, was using my gift to completely revolutionize his local community. The agonizing pain of the impending betrayal from Derek did not entirely vanish, but it was suddenly eclipsed by a hardened, unbreakable resolve. Blood means absolutely nothing if it is thoroughly corrupted by pure greed. True character means absolutely everything. I placed my right hand firmly on the shoulder of Leo, feeling a genuine sense of paternal pride that I had not experienced in many long years. I told him that his father would be incredibly proud of the strong man he had become, and that I was deeply honored to be a part of his remarkable journey. We spent the next hour discussing the architectural plans for the building. He showed me the blueprints for the new classrooms and the budget allocations for the advanced machinery. For a brief, wonderful moment, I forgot about the forged medical power of attorney. I forgot about the Nexus Global executives and the impending federal sting operation. I was simply an old engineer sharing my endless passion with a bright young mind. When Leo finally left, thanking me profusely one last time, the house returned to its quiet state. But the oppressive silence was gone forever, replaced by a cold, calculating anticipation. The clock struck midnight, and then 1 in the morning. I sat waiting in the dark living room. At exactly 2 in the morning, A series of unmarked black vans silently pulled into my long driveway. The federal tech team had arrived. 6 agents dressed in dark tactical gear slipped through my back door, carrying heavy equipment cases. They moved with absolute, silent precision. Within an hour, they had meticulously wired my entire living room with hidden cameras. They placed audio transmitters inside the lampshades and staged 2 fully armed intervention teams in the upstairs guest bedrooms. The sun rose on Friday morning, casting cold shadows across the hardwood floors of my living room. I sat in my usual armchair, but nothing about this morning was normal. The house was entirely silent, yet filled with an unseen presence. Upstairs, hiding behind the closed doors of the guest bedrooms, 2 fully armed federal intervention teams waited in absolute stillness. Every lamp and bookshelf contained hidden cameras and sensitive audio transmitters. The trap was perfectly calibrated. I looked at the grandfather clock. It was 8:45. I had 15 minutes left before my son arrived to destroy me. I focused on my breathing, slowing my heart rate, forcing the analytical mind of a chief engineer to override the shattering grief of a broken father. I needed to play my part flawlessly. I rumpled my shirt slightly and allowed my shoulders to slump, adopting the posture of a frail, exhausted old man who had been kept awake all night by family worry. I placed an empty, clean ceramic coffee cup specifically behind the decorative throw pillows on the sofa, keeping it completely out of sight but easily within my reach. The execution of this plan required absolute uncompromising perfection. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a funeral bell. I took a deep, steadying breath, leaned heavily on the armrest to push myself up, and shuffled slowly toward the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. Derek and Monica stood on the front porch, bathed in the bright morning sunlight. They looked like a picture-perfect couple straight out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. Derek wore a tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, holding a sleek black leather briefcase firmly in his right hand now. I knew exactly what that briefcase contained now. It held the forged medical power of attorney and the stolen patent transfer deeds that would legally hand my life's work over to Nexus Global. Monica stood beside him, radiating a toxic, manufactured warmth. She was carrying a cardboard tray, holding 3 large cups of gourmet coffee from my favorite local cafe. She wore her sweetest, fakest smile, the exact kind of smile a predator wears right before it decides to strike. "Good morning, Dad," Derek said, his voice dripping with an artificial concern that made my stomach turn completely upside down. "We wanted to come check on you. We know you have been incredibly stressed about Monica's brother." I forced a weak, trembling smile and stepped aside to let them enter my home. "Thank you for coming," I whispered, making my voice sound deliberately hoarse and fragile. "I barely slept a single wink last night. The worry is simply eating me alive. Come in, please." They stepped into the foyer, completely unaware that their every movement was now being broadcast live to the federal agents waiting upstairs and the command center downtown. They walked straight into the main living room area. Derek placed the black leather briefcase carefully on the glass coffee table, treating the instrument of my absolute destruction with profound reverence. Monica leaned forward, picking up one specific cup from the cardboard tray and holding it out to me with both of her hands. "I brought your absolute favorite, Richard," she said, her voice soothing and sickeningly sweet. "Dark roast, black, just the way you like it. You look completely exhausted today. You need to drink this and just relax. We are going to take care of absolutely everything." I reached out with trembling hands and took the cup. I looked down at the dark liquid inside. It looked like ordinary coffee. It smelled like ordinary coffee. But I knew the terrifying truth. I knew it was heavily laced with potent black market central nervous system depressants. I was holding a chemical weapon designed to shut down my cognitive functions, slur my speech, and dropped me to the floor in a state of profound, helpless confusion. They wanted me paralyzed so they could legally declare me incompetent and steal my $15 million legacy without a fight. I held the cup close to my chest, letting warmth seep in. I looked directly into my son's eyes. I searched his face for any lingering trace of guilt, any small hesitation, any sign that he was struggling with the monstrous act he was about to commit. But I found absolutely nothing. Derek looked back at me with calm, cold calculation. He was simply waiting for the poison to take effect. He was waiting for his father to collapse so he could open that briefcase and collect his blood money. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me, eliminating any remaining hesitation in my own heart. The war was ending now. I brought the edge of the cup to my lips, pretending to take a hesitant sip. I did not let a single drop touch my tongue. I immediately pulled the cup away and began to violently cough. I hunched over in my armchair, shaking my shoulders, squeezing my eyes shut and gasping loudly for air. Derek and Monica sat up straight, their eyes widening in sudden alarm. "Derek," I gasped out between heavy theatrical coughs, pressing my free hand against my chest. "My throat is incredibly dry. Please, go to the kitchen. Get me a glass of cold water now." Derek immediately jumped up, his face pale with sudden urgency. He turned his back to me and walked quickly toward the kitchen. Monica instinctively turned her head to watch him go, momentarily distracted by this sudden interruption. I knew I had a window of exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds where neither of them was looking directly at me. With the lightning-fast precision of an engineer, I reached down to the decorative potted fern. I aggressively tipped the paper cup, dumping the poisoned coffee straight into the dark soil. I replaced it with the identical clean cup hidden behind me. I brought the cup to my mouth as Derek walked back in, holding a glass of ice water. He handed it to me with fabricated concern. I thanked him weakly, taking a small sip of water and a long swallow from the unpoisoned cup. I sighed, sinking deeper into the cushions. The trap was fully in motion. I knew the chemical properties of the sedatives he thought I had ingested. They were designed to act fast, shutting down the central nervous system within a 10-minute window. I sat there, engaging them in slow conversation, calculating every passing second. 5 minutes passed. I let my eyelids droop heavily, blinking slowly, as if fighting a wave of fatigue. I allowed my posture to collapse, sliding down the armchair until my chin rested against my chest. 7 minutes passed. I intentionally dropped the cup onto the rug. It landed with a soft thud, the liquid staining the fabric. Monica gasped, but I did not apologize. Instead, I let my head roll to the side, my mouth hanging open. The performance required absolute dedication. I slowed my breathing, making each inhalation sound shallow and labored. 10 minutes passed. The invisible timer in my mind rang. I looked blindly toward the ceiling, letting my eyes unfocus completely. I forced my jaw slack and let out a low whisper. "Derek." I slurred, dragging the syllables out with thick confusion. "Derek, I feel dizzy. Everything is spinning." I let my head loll back against the chair, letting my arms fall limp at my sides. I was the picture of a broken, incapacitated old man. For 3 agonizing seconds, the room was silent. I waited in the darkness of my closed eyes, listening intently to the shifting atmosphere. Then the tension shattered in the most horrifying way possible. Monica laughed out loud. It was not a nervous giggle or a sigh of relief. It was a sharp burst of cruel laughter that echoed off the high ceilings. "It worked, you idiot! Hurry up!" she practically screamed, clapping her hands together in sheer delight. All the fake sweetness, all manufactured concern evaporated in a fraction of a second. I heard the sharp click of the black leather briefcase popping open on the glass coffee table. The metallic snap sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Derek let out a breath that sounded like a mix of adrenaline and pure greed. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not check my pulse to see if I was dying. He stepped aggressively into my personal space. I felt his strong hands grab my right wrist. He was rough, treating my arm like a lifeless piece of heavy machinery rather than human flesh. He yanked my limp arm forward, pulling me slightly out of the chair, so my hand hovered directly over the glass table. I kept my eyes closed to a narrow slit, just enough to see the stack of legal documents he had spread out before me. Right on top was the forged medical power of attorney, complete with the corrupt judge's fraudulent signature. Right beneath it were the highly classified blueprints for the Apex next-generation turbine technology, accompanied by the official patent transfer deeds. Derek forced a fountain pen into my supposedly paralyzed hand. His fingers wrapped tightly around my knuckles, crushing them together in a vice grip. I remained completely limp, offering no physical resistance as he forcefully dragged my hand across the bottom of the first page. He pressed the nib down so hard that I could hear the sharp scratching sound tearing into the thick paper. He was physically forging my biometric signature, stealing my entire legacy stroke by agonizing stroke. He finished the first signature and flipped to the second document, panting heavily with the exertion of his own treason. Monica stood behind him, cheering him on like a spectator at a morbid sporting event. "Keep going," she urged him, her voice trembling with the anticipation of $15 million. "Just get the patent deeds signed before he wakes up." Derek adjusted his grip on my hand, preparing to drag my fingers across the final, most devastating document. The pen touched the paper. But before he could complete the first letter of my stolen name, a heavy, commanding knock echoed from the front door. The sound was so loud and unexpected that it made Monica jump backward with a startled gasp. Derek stopped moving. He released my crushed hand, letting it fall lifelessly back onto my lap. He stood up straight, smoothing the intentional wrinkles out of his expensive suit. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face, transforming him into a creature of pure corporate malice. "Right on time," he whispered to his wife. He turned his back and walked confidently toward the foyer. Through the narrow slits of my eyes, I watched his every movement. I listened as the deadbolt clicked open, followed by the smooth swing of the wooden door. Standing on my front porch were two men I recognized instantly. They were high-level corporate executives from Nexus Global, dressed in sharp, tailored dark suits. They looked like undertakers arriving to collect a profitable corpse. The taller of the two men carried a silver metal briefcase secured with a combination lock. It was the briefcase holding the $15 million in untraceable bearer bonds. Derek opened the door wider, stepping aside with a theatrical sweep. He welcomed the corporate predators directly into my home, inviting the very people who had spent a decade trying to destroy my career to walk in and purchase my stolen life. The two executives stepped over the threshold, their polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. They did not say a word as they entered the living room, their cold eyes immediately locking onto the stack of stolen blueprints resting on the coffee table. The final pieces of the treasonous puzzle were now standing right in front of me. The taller of the two executives, a man with a sharp jawline and calculating gray eyes, stepped forward and approached the glass coffee table. He did not spare me a single glance. To him, I was not a human being with a 40-year legacy of hard work and dedication. I was simply a minor logistical obstacle that had been successfully neutralized. He set the heavy silver briefcase down on the floor next to his polished leather shoes. The second executive, a slightly older man with thinning dark hair, pulled a pair of reading glasses from his suit pocket and leaned over the stack of legal documents. The room was suffocatingly quiet save for the sound of their steady breathing and the faint rustling of paper. Derek stood beside them, practically vibrating with nervous energy. He nervously adjusted his silk tie and rubbed his palms against the fabric of his expensive trousers. The older executive carefully picked up the forged medical power of attorney. He scrutinized the fraudulent signature of the corrupt judge, tracing the lines with his index finger to ensure it appeared authentic. Then he turned his attention to the classified blueprints. These were the designs I had poured my absolute soul into the revolutionary turbine technology that was supposed to secure the future of Apex Dynamics for the next 2 decades. The older executive flipped through the highly detailed schematics. His eyes darted across the complex mathematical calculations and advanced aerodynamic structures. A small, greedy smile slowly formed on his thin lips. He looked up from his papers and finally directed his cold gaze toward me. I kept my eyes closed to a narrow slit, maintaining my position as a helpless victim. My head remained lolled back against the fabric of the armchair, my jaw completely slack, my arms hanging uselessly at my sides. "He is completely out," Derek quickly assured them, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "He took the heavily laced coffee over 10 minutes ago. The central nervous system depressants have entirely paralyzed his cognitive functions. He cannot hear us, he cannot see us, and he absolutely cannot stop us. The patents are legally yours now. You have the forged medical power of attorney, and you have his biometric signature, authorizing the permanent transfer of all intellectual property. The transaction is completely finished." The taller executive nodded in silent agreement, clearly satisfied with the absolute thoroughness of my son's treason. The betrayal was so profound that it physically burned my chest. My only child had systematically dismantled my life's work and proudly presented it to my fiercest corporate enemies on a silver platter. Derek stepped forward, unable to contain his desperate anticipation any longer. He spread his hands out over the glass table. "I have delivered exactly what I promised you," he said, his voice rising in pitch. "The blueprints are flawless. The patents are yours. Where is my $15 million? The taller executive reached down and lifted the silver metal briefcase from the floor. He placed it squarely in the center of the glass coffee table right beside my stolen legacy. The metallic sound of the heavy latches snapping open echoed loudly throughout the quiet living room. He slowly lifted the lid. Inside, resting on dark velvet lining, were thick, perfectly arranged stacks of high-denomination bearer bonds. They were completely untraceable, highly liquid, and represented the ultimate culmination of my son's horrifying greed. The sight of the incredible wealth caused an immediate visceral reaction in the room. Monica let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She stepped closer to the table, her eyes widening to impossible proportions as she stared at the overwhelming fortune. Derek practically leaned over the table, his entire body shaking with uncontrolled excitement. His hands hovered just inches above the bearer bonds, his fingers twitching, as if he physically craved the touch of the stolen wealth. He had traded his father's freedom, his own soul, and 40 years of absolute paternal devotion for this single silver briefcase. The federal crime of corporate espionage was now fully executed. The financial transaction was completely undeniable. But what they did not know was that this entire sickening exchange was being meticulously recorded from 6 different angles by the hidden 4,000 pixel cameras wired directly into my living room walls. The federal agents upstairs were watching every single movement. The audio transmitters hidden inside the lampshades were capturing every single spoken word with crystal clear precision. The evidence was absolute, devastating, and thoroughly irrefutable. I remained entirely motionless in my chair, forcing my breathing to stay incredibly shallow and ragged, playing the role of the incapacitated victim to absolute perfection. The taller Nexus executive snapped the briefcase shut and slid it across the smooth glass surface toward my son. The older executive carefully gathered the signed patent transfer deeds and the forged medical power of attorney, slipping them securely into his own dark leather portfolio. They had achieved their sinister corporate objective. They had successfully stolen 40 years of Apex Dynamics engineering brilliance for a mere fraction of its actual market value. Without uttering another single syllable, the 2 ruthless corporate predators turned their backs on me and walked briskly out of my home, leaving the front door slightly ajar behind them. The trap was now fully closed. Derek stood completely frozen for a brief moment, staring blankly at the silver briefcase resting on the table. Then he let out a loud, victorious laugh that chilled me to the bone. He grabbed the handle of the briefcase, his knuckles turning entirely white. He had won. He truly believed he had beaten me. His greedy eyes were practically glowing with an intense, burning satisfaction as he looked down at the massive fortune he had just acquired through sheer betrayal. This was the absolute darkest moment of his entire miserable life. Derek slowly turned to Monica. "Call the ambulance. Tell them my dad had a stroke and his mind is gone." The heavy silence in the living room was broken by the eager sound of Monica frantically digging into her designer purse to retrieve her smartphone. She was practically breathless, her fingers trembling with the dark thrill of their supposed victory. She pulled the phone out and swiped quickly across the screen, fully prepared to dial the emergency dispatch numbers and perform the final act of our tragedy. The two corporate predators from Nexus Global had already turned their backs to me, entirely dismissing my existence as they adjusted their silk ties and prepared to walk out the front door with my life's work tucked inside their dark leather portfolio. Derek stood tall over the glass coffee table, his hands resting possessively on the silver briefcase filled with $15 million in untraceable bearer bonds. He let out a long, slow exhale of pure, unfiltered triumph, a sound that carried the absolute destruction of his own soul. He truly believed he had won. He believed he had successfully erased his father from the world, stripped away my legacy, and secured a future built entirely on treason and deceit. The trap was fully loaded, the evidence was meticulously captured, and the agonizing performance was finally ready to end. I kept my head lolled back against the armchair for one final suspended second. Then I slowly opened my eyes. The blurry, unfocused gaze I had carefully maintained instantly vanished, replaced by the sharp clarity of a chief engineer. I did not groan and I did not stumble. I placed my hands firmly on the armrests and pushed myself up, sitting perfectly straight. The physical movement was so sudden and so contrary to the paralyzing effects of the heavy sedatives they thought I had consumed that it sent a visible shockwave through the room. I calmly reached up to my neck and smoothly adjusted my collar with practiced precision. I took a deep, steady breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs completely, clearing away the suffocating tension of the last hour. I turned my head and looked directly at Monica. She had the phone pressed against her ear, but her eyes caught my movement and she froze entirely. "I actually prefer my coffee, black, Monica," I said, my voice ringing out through the quiet living room, completely devoid of any slurring or confusion. It was steady, resonant, and made of absolute steel. The sedatives made it far too bitter. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. Monica let out a sharp, terrified gasp, dropping her smartphone directly onto the hardwood floor. The device shattered with a loud crack, but nobody looked down. Her face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure horror, as she stared at me as if I had just risen from the dead. Derek whipped his head around so fast his neck cracked. His mouth fell open, his eyes widening to impossible proportions. The arrogant smirk that had dominated his face just seconds ago was violently ripped away, replaced by the crushing realization that his reality was collapsing. His hands resting so proudly on the silver briefcase suddenly lost all their strength. He stumbled backward, his knee hitting the edge of the glass coffee table. The heavy silver briefcase tipped over the edge and crashed onto the floor. The metal latches sprang open upon impact, and the thick stacks of untraceable bearer bonds spilled out, scattering across the rug like worthless pieces of trash. The two executives from Nexus Global, halfway to the foyer, stopped dead in their tracks. They spun around, their faces shifting from cold professionalism to sheer panic. The taller executive instinctively reached for the door handle, his survival instincts kicking into maximum overdrive, but he found his feet frozen to the spot. They were highly intelligent men, and it only took them a fraction of a second to look at my composed posture, listen to my clear voice, and realize they had walked directly into a massive, meticulously orchestrated counter trap. The older executive clutched his dark leather portfolio tightly against his chest, his eyes darting wildly around the room, as if searching for the hidden cameras he suddenly knew must be watching them. He knew the crime of corporate espionage had just been fully executed and verified. They were completely trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Derek tried to speak. He opened his mouth, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto a dry deck, but his vocal cords entirely refused to function. He looked at the spilled bearer bonds, then at the forged medical power of attorney, and finally at me. He raised a trembling hand, pointing a finger at me as if trying to cast a spell to force me back to sleep. He took a stumbling step forward, his mind desperately trying to construct a new lie, any possible narrative that could explain away the monstrous treason he had just committed. He wanted to say it was a misunderstanding, a bizarre corporate game. He wanted to use the word father to shield himself from the impending destruction. Before Derek could utter a single pathetic word, the silence of the house was violently shattered. The heavy doors of the hallway closet burst open with a deafening crash. At the exact same moment, the solid oak doors of the upstairs guest bedrooms were kicked open. The synchronized sound of combat boots pounding against the floorboards echoed through the entire house. Harrison Cole, my ruthless corporate attorney, marched purposefully into the living room from the kitchen hallway, his face set in an expression of pure justice. Right beside him walked the chief executive officer of Apex Dynamics, his eyes burning with absolute fury as he looked directly at the Nexus executives. And flooding into the living room, pouring from the stairs and corridors with terrifying speed and precision, were 6 heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their tactical gear imposing, as they completely surrounded my treacherous family. The commanding shout of the lead federal agent shattered whatever fragile illusions remained inside my living room. "Move and you will be secured by force," he roared, his weapon drawn, and aimed directly at the older executive from Nexus Global, the 2 corporate predators, men who had built entire careers on ruthless intimidation and silent boardroom thefts, completely lost their nerve. The taller executive instinctively raised his hands above his head, dropping his dark leather portfolio onto the carpet. It landed with a dull, heavy thud, spilling the stolen patent transfer deeds and the forged medical power of attorney completely. 2 heavily armed agents moved forward with terrifying speed and absolute precision. They grabbed the Nexus executives by the shoulders, forcefully spinning them around. The impact of their bodies slamming against the painted drywall shook the entire foundation of my house. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around their wrists echoed loudly in the confined space. Harrison Cole stood directly beside the front door, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the systematic destruction of our corporate enemies with a cold, unrelenting satisfaction. The chief executive officer of Apex Dynamics simply shook his head in absolute disgust. I remained seated perfectly straight in my armchair, watching the catastrophic failure of my son unfold in real time. Derek was completely paralyzed by the sudden violence of the tactical intervention. The silver briefcase he had just knocked off the glass coffee table lay completely forgotten on the hardwood floor, surrounded by the scattered fortune of untraceable bearer bonds. He began to hyperventilate, taking short, ragged gasps of air as if the oxygen had been entirely sucked out of the room. He stumbled back, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the scattered papers until his back hit the wall. He pressed himself tightly into the corner, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. The arrogant smirk that had dominated his face for the last hour was entirely gone, replaced by the primitive, completely naked terror of a trapped animal. He looked wildly around the room, his gaze darting from the armed federal agents to the handcuffed Nexus executives, and finally settling on me. But I offered him absolutely no comfort. I stared back at him with the cold, hardened resolve of an engineer, watching a deeply flawed and heavily compromised mechanical structure finally collapse under immense pressure. Monica, who had been completely frozen in shock since dropping her shattered smartphone, suddenly found her voice. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream, that forced one of the federal agents to visibly wince. Her instinct for absolute personal survival immediately overrode any lingering loyalty she held for her husband. She backed away from Derek as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. She raised her trembling right hand and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at his chest. "I did not do anything," she wailed, her voice cracking with a manufactured, desperate terror that filled the tense room. "I made me do all of this." Monica screamed, tears of pure panic ruining her expensive makeup. I am just his wife. I did not know what was inside that briefcase. He forced me to lie to you about the cartel kidnapping. He forced me to bring the poisoned coffee today. He threatened to leave me if I did not help him steal the money. She was weaponizing her tears again, desperately trying to construct a brand new narrative of victimhood to save her own skin. Derek stared at her in absolute disbelief, completely destroyed by her immediate, ruthless betrayal. The lead federal agent ignored her hysterical performance entirely. He stepped forward, placing himself directly between Derek and the scattered bearer bonds. The agent was a tall, uncompromising man who radiated absolute authority. He looked down at my son with an expression of profound, professional disgust. "Derek Caldwell," he stated, his deep voice carrying the full, crushing weight of the federal justice system. "You are officially under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You have the right to remain entirely silent, and I highly suggest you use it before you further incriminate yourself in this massive, highly documented conspiracy." The agent pulled a folded warrant from his tactical vest and began to read the formal charges. The words fell upon my son like heavy, relentless blows from a hammer. "You are being charged with federal corporate espionage," the agent read clearly. "You are also charged with grand wire fraud, the intentional forgery of binding legal documents, and a premeditated conspiracy to commit severe elder abuse." Derek slumped further down the wall, his legs trembling so violently they could barely support his body weight. The monumental scale of his criminal treason was finally being spoken aloud in the bright daylight. The lead agent did not stop there. He looked directly into the terrified eyes of my son and delivered the final, devastating mathematical calculation of his greed. Based on the financial magnitude of the stolen intellectual property and the explicit premeditation of the medical power of attorney, you are currently facing a total maximum sentence of 35 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. 35 years. The number echoed in the quiet living room. Derek would be an old, broken man by the time he finally walked outside as a truly free man again. The absolute reality of his doomed future finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his fragile ego. Derek let out a guttural, agonizing sob. He collapsed completely, falling heavily to his knees on the hardwood floor. He ignored the federal agents standing right beside him. He ignored his sobbing wife. He turned his wet and terrified face toward me. He began to drag himself across the floor, crawling frantically through the scattered bearer bonds until he reached my armchair. He lunged forward, grabbing my leather shoes with his trembling hands. "Dad, please, I am your son. Stop them," he cried. I looked down at the man kneeling on my hardwood floor. He clutched my shoes with an agonizing grip, tears streaming down his flushed face, begging for mercy. He never planned to show me. The desperation in his voice was raw. He was no longer the arrogant consultant who walked into my home with a forged medical power of attorney. He was no longer the ruthless predator who laughed about locking his own father in a psychiatric ward. He was just a terrified thief, broken by the collapse of his monstrous greed. I stared into his eyes, searching for any trace of the little boy I raised. I looked for the son who proudly wore my hard hat, the young man whose tuition I paid with my own blood and sweat. But that boy was completely gone. He had been dead for a long time, replaced by the hollow stranger crawling at my feet. The pain in my chest was absolutely unbearable. It was a physical weight threatening to pull me down beside him. But I did not fall. I drew upon the decades of unyielding discipline that defined my career. I forced the blinding grief into a small corner of my mind and locked it away. When I finally spoke, my voice did not waver. It was not the voice of a broken father. It was forged from cold steel. I gave you my life. I said, the words ringing clearly in the silent living room. I gave you my wealth. I gave you every opportunity a father could possibly give his child. But the day you decided to sell my legacy to my worst enemies, the moment you planned to erase my mind with heavy sedatives and lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my days, you ceased to be my son. Derek let out an agonizing wail. It was the sound of a man watching his universe burn to the ground. He tightened his grip on my shoes, pressing his wet face against my ankles, begging me to remember family vacations and the good times we shared. But his emotional manipulation had no power over me anymore. The invisible strings he used to control my paternal guilt were severed. I looked past him, locking eyes with the lead federal agent. I gave a single definitive nod. The agent stepped forward immediately. He reached down with a firm grip, grabbing Derek by the shoulders of his expensive suit. He yanked him violently to his feet, tearing him away from me. Derek struggled, his arms flailing, as he tried to reach for me one last time, but the agent was too strong. He spun Derek around, slamming him face first against the wall right next to the handcuffed corporate executives. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs, snapping shut around my son's wrists, echoed through the room. It was the loudest, most definitive sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the absolute sound of closure. Monica was still screaming in the corner, her voice hoarse from hysterical crying. Two female federal agents were pulling her toward the front door. She dragged her feet across the carpet, turning her head to shoot venom at Derek, cursing his name, blaming him for dragging her into a federal conspiracy that would ruin her life forever. There was no loyalty among thieves. The moment their malicious plot failed, their perfect marriage disintegrated into a bitter battle for individual survival. I watched them turn on each other with a cold, detached fascination. Harrison Cole, my corporate attorney, stepped up beside my armchair. He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We won, Richard," he whispered quietly. "The patents are completely safe, the funds are legally frozen, and the perpetrators are in federal custody. Your legacy is absolutely secure." I thanked him softly, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion creeping into my bones. The massive adrenaline rush that sustained me throughout the morning was finally beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, hollow silence. The federal agents began to systematically clear the living room. They escorted the two Nexus global executives out the front door first. The men kept their heads down, hiding their faces in absolute shame as they were marched into the morning sunlight. Then came Monica, still weeping uncontrollably, her designer clothes completely ruined. Finally, the lead agent walked Derek toward the exit. My son stopped right in the doorway. He turned his head slowly, looking back at me one final time over his shoulder. His eyes were completely hollow, devoid of any hope or arrogance. He opened his mouth to speak, but the federal agent gave him a firm push forward, forcing him out the door before he could utter a single word. I pushed out of the armchair and walked toward the foyer. My legs felt heavy, but my mind was clear. I stepped out onto the front porch, the cool morning breeze hitting my face. The quiet street of my neighborhood was lined with unmarked black federal vehicles and flashing police cruisers. The neighbors were standing on their lawns, watching in shock, as the highly paid corporate consultant and his beautiful wife were shoved into the back of a police car. I stood on the porch with my hands on the wooden railing. I watched as the heavy doors of the police cruisers slammed shut. The engines roared to life, and the convoy pulled away from the curb, driving down the street until they disappeared around the corner. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance. The neighborhood returned to a state of profound silence. There were no more threats. There were no more lies. There were no more poisoned cups of coffee or forged legal documents waiting to destroy my life. The brutal war that raged inside my home was finally over. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I was truly safe. I accepted the invitation without a single second of hesitation. I ended the call, walked to my closet, and picked out a simple, comfortable suit. I did not need a tuxedo or a corporate badge today. I drove my car through the bustling city streets, heading toward the industrial district where Leo had rented the space. The neighborhood was rough around the edges, filled with old brick buildings and cracked sidewalks, but there was a palpable energy in the air. As I turned the corner, I saw the massive warehouse. It had been completely transformed. The exterior walls were freshly painted in bright, welcoming colors, and large, clean windows let the natural sunlight pour into the building. A crowd of people had already gathered outside the main entrance. There were parents, local community leaders, and dozens of children of all ages, buzzing with pure, unfiltered excitement. I parked my car and walked toward the building. Before I could even reach the front steps, Leo spotted me from the crowd. He was wearing a sharp, well-fitted suit, looking like a true leader. He ran over and embraced me with a firm, genuine hug. He thanked me for coming, his voice thick with emotion. I told him I would not have missed this day for anything in the world. He guided me through the crowd, parting the sea of excited families, and escorted me directly into the main facility. The moment I stepped through the double doors, I was absolutely breathless. The sheer scale of the transformation was staggering. The empty, hollow concrete space I had seen in the photographs 3 months ago was now a state-of-the-art engineering wonderland. The high ceilings were fitted with brilliant energy, efficient lighting. Rows of spotless metal workbenches filled the main floor, each equipped with brand-new computer programming stations, soldering irons, and advanced diagnostic tools. In the back corner, I saw a dedicated fabrication shop surrounded by thick safety glass housing commercial-grade 3-dimensional printers and precision cutting machines. It was not just a makeshift workshop. It was a professional, fully realized academy for young, hungry minds. Hundreds of kids were already inside, exploring the different stations with wide, mesmerized eyes. I watched a group of teenagers huddled around a robotics table, eagerly examining the exposed wiring of a small mechanical drone. I saw younger children sitting at the computers, their fingers flying across the keyboards as they learned the basic logic of coding. The air was filled with the beautiful, chaotic symphony of learning. It was the sound of gears turning, motors humming, and children laughing as they discovered the limitless potential of their own creativity. I stood near the entrance, entirely overwhelmed by the profound magnitude of what my grant money had achieved. This was not a passive donation. This was a living, breathing engine of opportunity. Leo walked up to a small wooden podium set up in the center of the main floor. He tapped the microphone, and the loud echoing feedback instantly silenced the chatter in the room. The children and parents turned their attention toward him. Leo looked out at the bright, hopeful faces in the crowd, taking a deep, steadying breath. He spoke with a powerful, commanding voice that echoed off the high ceilings. He talked about his late father, Thomas, and the deep, enduring value of hard work and uncompromising integrity. He spoke about the struggles of growing up in this exact neighborhood, surrounded by poverty and a devastating lack of opportunity. He told the children that society often tells them they do not matter, that their dreams are too expensive or too impossible to achieve. But today, he said, all of those limitations were permanently shattered. Today, they had a sanctuary where they could build their own futures with their own 2 hands. Then Leo turned his gaze directly toward me. The entire crowd followed his eyes, looking at the old man standing quietly in the back of the room. Leo told them the story of a man who spent 40 years building a corporate legacy, a man who faced unimaginable personal betrayal yet still chose to give his wealth to complete strangers. He told them that this entire facility, every computer, every machine, and every tool was made possible because of my absolute faith in their potential. A sudden, thunderous round of applause erupted from the crowd. Hundreds of hands clapping, parents cheering, and kids looking at me with pure, unadulterated gratitude. I felt hot tears pricking the corners of my eyes. I had spent my entire life trying to earn the loyalty and respect of my own flesh and blood. I had sacrificed my time, my energy, and my soul to provide for a son who ultimately viewed me as nothing more than a disposable obstacle to his greed. I had lost a son to the dark, unforgiving abyss of corporate entitlement. But standing in that brilliant, sunlit warehouse, looking at the faces of 100 children who finally had a safe place to learn and grow, the agonizing void in my heart was instantly filled. Leo stepped down from the podium and grabbed a pair of large ceremonial scissors. He walked over to a thick red ribbon stretched across the entrance of the main robotics laboratory. He asked me to join him. I walked through the crowd, feeling the warm, appreciative pats on my back from the parents. I stood beside Leo, and together we closed the scissors, slicing cleanly through the bright red fabric. The crowd erupted into wild, deafening cheers. Leo reached up and pulled a heavy canvas tarp down from the wall above the laboratory doors. The fabric fell, revealing a massive silver plaque. It read, "The Thomas and Richard Caldwell Innovation Center." My name was immortalized alongside my dearest friend in a place of boundless hope. I lost a biological son to pure greed, but today I gained 1,000 children. I finally found peace. Blood does not automatically make someone family. Respect, loyalty, and unwavering integrity do. I spent decades building a corporate legacy, blindly trusting my only son to inherit my life's work. Instead, I learned the agonizing lesson that endless generosity can breed monstrous entitlement. When the people you love view your existence as a mere obstacle to their wealth, you must find the absolute courage to cut them loose, no matter how deeply it breaks your heart. True wealth is never about the money you accumulate, but the profound good you can do for those who actually deserve your ongoing help. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more real-life lessons. Have you ever faced a heartbreaking betrayal from someone you deeply trusted? Tell me your story in the comments below. Let's heal, learn, and grow stronger together as a community.